In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling green hills and thick forests, life moved at a gentle pace. People knew each other by name, and the air always carried the faint scent of blooming flowers or freshly cut grass. It was the kind of place where everyone felt safe, where doors were left unlocked at night and where children played freely in the streets until the sun dipped below the horizon. But even in such a peaceful place, tragedy can strike without warning, shattering lives and leaving scars that may never fully heal. Ethan was one of those people who seemed to light up every room he entered. At just 24 years old, he had already made a name for himself as someone who cared deeply about others. He worked part-time at the local library, helping kids find books that sparked their imagination, and spent his weekends volunteering at the community center. His drawings, colorful and full of life, often adorned the walls of the cafe downtown. Ethan's smile was infectious, and his laugh could fill an entire room with warmth. To his mother, Margaret, he was everything: her pride, her joy, and the reason she woke up every morning with purpose. Margaret had raised Ethan on her own after losing her husband, John, to illness when Ethan was only 6. Life hadn't been easy for them. There were days when money was tight, bills piled up, and sleep came in short bursts. But through it all, Margaret held on to hope. She poured every ounce of love and energy into raising Ethan, teaching him kindness, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what was right. In return, Ethan grew into a remarkable young man who brought light into her life, even during its darkest moments. That's why the news of Ethan's death hit the town like a thunderclap. One rainy evening, while driving home from work, Ethan's car skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. The police said it happened quickly, a combination of slick roads and poor visibility. By the time help arrived, it was too late. When Margaret got the call, her world stopped spinning. For hours, she sat frozen on the couch, clutching the phone, unable to process what she had just heard. Friends and neighbors gathered around her, offering hugs and words of comfort, but nothing could ease the crushing weight of her grief. The days that followed passed in a blur. Margaret barely ate or slept. Every corner of her house reminded her of Ethan. The stack of art supplies on his desk, the guitar leaning against the wall, the muddy boots by the door that he always forgot to put away. Each item told a story, a memory of happier times, but now they only served as painful reminders of what she had lost. Still, she forced herself to keep moving forward because she knew Ethan would have wanted her to be strong. The funeral preparations began almost immediately. The whole town came together to honor Ethan's memory. Flowers flooded the church, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. Photographs of Ethan lined the walls, pictures of him as a child, playing soccer, graduating, high school, laughing with friends. A makeshift memorial sprang up outside the library where he worked, covered in notes and mementos from those whose lives he had touched. Everyone agreed that Ethan deserved a beautiful farewell, a celebration of the life he had lived, rather than mourning the life he wouldn't get to live. On the day of the funeral, the church overflowed with people. Rows of pews filled quickly, and extra chairs had to be brought in to accommodate the crowd. Friends, family, teachers, co-workers, all came to pay their respects. Some cried silently, clutching tissues in trembling hands. Others shared stories of how Ethan had impacted their lives, recounting moments of laughter, kindness, and inspiration. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. At the front of the church stood the casket, closed and draped with a simple white cloth. Margaret sat in the front row, staring at it, her heart heavy with sorrow. She couldn't stop thinking about the last time she saw Ethan alive. He had kissed her goodbye that morning, promising to stop by the grocery store on his way home to pick up ingredients for dinner. "I'll make your favorite lasagna tonight," he'd said with a grin. Those words replayed in her mind over and over again, taunting her with the cruel reality that he would never come home. As the service began, the priest spoke softly, offering prayers and comforting words, but Margaret barely heard him. Her thoughts kept drifting back to something Ethan had once told her. "Mom," he'd said during one of their late-night conversations, "if anything ever happens to me, I want an open casket funeral." I don't want anyone to miss saying goodbye. Margaret remembered nodding, not wanting to entertain the idea of losing him. Now, sitting here with the casket closed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After the service ended, attendees filed out of the church, heading toward the cemetery for the burial. As the pallbearers carried the casket to the waiting hearse, Margaret lingered behind, her eyes fixed on the polished wood. Her gut told her something wasn't adding up. Why was the casket closed? Hadn't Ethan specifically asked for it to be open? She tried to push the thought aside, telling herself it was just her grief talking, but the nagging suspicion refused to go away. When the procession reached the gravesite, Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. Tears streamed down her face, but beneath the sadness lurked a growing sense of unease. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she stepped forward. Ignoring the murmurs of surprise from those around her, she approached the casket. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her determination was clear. "Open it," she demanded. "I need to see my son." For a moment, no one moved. The funeral director hesitated, glancing nervously at the crowd. "Mrs. Carter," he began gently, "we've already explained—" "I don't care what you've explained," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "That's my son in there. Open it. Now." Reluctantly, the funeral staff complied. They pried open the lid of the casket, revealing what lay inside. And what Margaret saw next would change everything. For her, for the town, and for the truth about Ethan's fate. As the lid of the casket creaked open, Margaret braced herself for the sight of her son. She had prepared herself emotionally, or so she thought, for this final goodbye. Her heart was heavy with grief, but also with a strange sense of determination. She needed to see Ethan one last time, to confirm for herself that he was truly gone. But as the funeral staff stepped aside and the interior of the casket came into view, Margaret froze. What she saw wasn't her son at all. Lying inside was a man, middle-aged, with graying hair and sharp features that were completely unfamiliar. His face was pale, almost wax-like, and his hands were folded neatly across his chest. He wore a suit that looked hastily chosen, not something Ethan would ever pick out for himself. The shock hit Margaret like a tidal wave. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind raced, trying desperately to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't Ethan. It couldn't be. The crowd around her erupted into murmurs. Some gasped audibly. Others whispered nervously to one another. A few people took a step back, their faces pale with disbelief. Margaret's knees buckled under the weight of her confusion and horror. She reached out instinctively, gripping the edge of the casket to steady herself. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cold metal frame. This isn't my son," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. They were too stunned to speak. The funeral director rushed forward, his expression a mix of panic and embarrassment. "Mrs. Carter, please," he began, his tone pleading. "There must be some misunderstanding. Let's discuss this privately." "No," Margaret snapped, cutting him off. Her voice was louder now, firmer. She straightened up, her eyes blazing with anger and confusion. "You tell me right here, right now. Where is my son? Who is this?" She pointed accusingly at the body and the casket, her hand shaking violently. The director hesitated, clearly flustered. We were told this was Ethan," he said finally, stumbling over his words. "The hospital confirmed it. We followed procedure exactly as we were instructed." "But it's not him," Margaret shouted, her voice echoing across the cemetery. Heads turned in every direction as more people gathered closer, drawn by the commotion. Tears streamed down her face, but her focus remained razor-sharp. She refused to let anyone dismiss her concerns or brush her aside. Something was terribly wrong, and she intended to get answers. Detective Harris, who had been standing quietly near the back of the crowd observing the scene, stepped forward. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, someone who had served the town for over 2 decades. People trusted him, and he rarely raised his voice unless absolutely necessary. Sensing the gravity of the situation, he approached Margaret, cautiously. "Ma'am," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's take a breath and figure this out together. I'll need to ask you a few questions." Margaret nodded, though her body still quivered with emotion. Detective Harris signaled for the funeral staff to close the casket temporarily while he organized the growing crowd. Officers arrived quickly, cordoning off the area with yellow tape. Whispers spread like wildfire among the attendees, each person speculating about what could have happened. Some suggested it might be a case of mistaken identity, while others voiced darker theories involving foul play. The once peaceful funeral had transformed into chaos, leaving everyone unsettled. As Harris began questioning Margaret, she recounted everything she knew about Ethan's accident. According to the police report, Ethan's car had skidded off the road during a rainstorm and crashed into a tree. Emergency responders found him unconscious, and despite their efforts to revive him, he passed away shortly afterward. Margaret remembered receiving the devastating news from Officer Daniels, who assured her that Ethan's body was taken directly to the morgue. From there, the funeral home handled the arrangements. Everything seemed straightforward, until now. Harris listened intently, jotting down notes in his small, leather-bound notebook. When Margaret finished speaking, he asked if she had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to Ethan's death. At first, she shook her head, unsure of how to answer. Then suddenly something clicked. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling again. "There was something odd." She explained that just 2 days before the crash, Ethan had acted strangely. He seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone and looking over his shoulder as though he were being followed. When she asked him about it, he brushed her off, saying it was nothing to worry about. But now, reflecting on those moments, Margaret realized there might have been more to it. Could Ethan have been hiding something? And if so, what? Harris promised to investigate further, starting with the hospital records and the morgue. Meanwhile, he instructed the funeral director to secure the mysterious body and keep it under strict supervision until its identity could be verified. As the initial shock began to settle, Margaret felt a surge of resolve wash over her. This wasn't just about finding out who the man in the cast was. It was about uncovering the truth about Ethan. Was he really dead? Or was there a chance, however slim, that he was still alive? The hours that followed were agonizing. Margaret paced back and forth outside the church, replaying every detail of the past week in her mind. She thought about Ethan's laughter, his kindness, his dreams for the future. How could any of that simply vanish overnight? It didn't make sense. She clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, her son wasn't gone after all. By late afternoon, Detective Harris returned with preliminary findings. The body in the casket belonged to a man named Robert Klein, a local businessman whose disappearance had gone unnoticed due to his reclusive nature. Authorities discovered that Klein had died under suspicious circumstances unrelated to Ethan's case. Someone, it appeared, had deliberately swapped the bodies, an act that raised countless questions about motive and opportunity. For Margaret, this revelation only deepened her resolve. If Ethan wasn't in that casket, then where was he? And why had someone gone to such lengths to deceive her? The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but she vowed to put them together, no matter what it took. With Harris by her side, she prepared to dig deeper, determined to uncover the truth even if it meant confronting forces far beyond what she could have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The air seemed heavier now, charged with an unsettling energy that made it hard to breathe. She stood near the casket, staring at the unfamiliar face of Robert Klein, trying to piece together how this man had ended up in her son's place. Her mind raced with questions, each more alarming than the last. Who was Robert Klein? Why had someone gone to such lengths to swap his body with Ethan's? And most importantly, where was Ethan? Detective Harris worked quickly, gathering evidence and coordinating with local authorities to unravel the tangled web of deception. By early evening, he called Margaret into a quiet corner of the church, away from prying eyes and curious whispers. His expression was grim but focused, and Margaret could tell he had uncovered something significant. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "We've identified the man in the casket as Robert Klein. He was reported missing 3 weeks ago by his business partner, who said they hadn't seen him since." Margaret frowned, struggling to connect the dots. "But what does this have to do with Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would someone put this man in my son's coffin?" Harris hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "That's what we're trying to figure out. From what we know so far, Mr. Klein died under suspicious circumstances, possibly foul play. Someone must have switched his body with Ethan's at some point after the accident. But why? Well, that's still unclear." Margaret's heart sank. The idea that Ethan might not be dead filled her with both hope and dread. If he wasn't in that casket, then where was he? Was he hurt, scared, or worse? Was he in danger? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her veins. She clenched her fists tightly, fighting back tears. "We need to find him," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength despite her fear. "Whatever it takes, Detective, please." Harris nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I promise you, Mrs. Carter, I'll do everything in my power to bring answers, but I need your help. Think back over the past few weeks. Did Ethan mention anything unusual? Any new friends, threats, or changes in behavior?" Margaret closed her eyes, sifting through memories. At first, nothing stood out. Then, like a flash of lightning, she remembered something. Just days before, the crash. Ethan had received a strange phone call. She hadn't paid much attention at the time. He often got calls from clients or coworkers, but this one seemed different. After hanging up, he had paced nervously around the kitchen, muttering to himself. When she asked him what was wrong, he brushed it off, saying it was just work-related stress. Now, though, those moments took on a darker meaning. "He got a call," Margaret told Harris urgently. It upset him, but he wouldn't say why. "And then later that night I heard him talking to someone outside. It sounded like an argument, but when I went to check, no one was there. I thought maybe I imagined it." Harris scribbled notes furiously, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you remember anything else, anything at all?" Margaret thought harder. Then another memory surfaced, one she hadn't considered important until now. A few nights earlier, Ethan had been working late in his room, hunched over his laptop. When she peeked in to remind him to eat dinner, he quickly minimized the screen, almost guiltily. She joked about him being too engrossed in social media, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he gave her a tight smile and promised to join her soon. Now looking back, his behavior seemed odd, not like him at all. "I think he was hiding something," Margaret admitted quietly, her voice cracking. "I don't know what it was, but it scared him. I can see that now." Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is helpful, Mrs. Carter. Every detail matters. Let me look into these leads, and I'll keep you updated every step of the way." As Harris left to coordinate with his team, Margaret retreated to a pew in the empty church. The once bustling space was eerily silent now, save for the faint hum of distant traffic. She sat there alone, her thoughts swirling like storm clouds. Her son's absence loomed large, a void she couldn't fill no matter how hard she tried. Yet amid the despair, a flicker of hope remained. If Ethan wasn't in that casket, there was still a chance he was alive, and she refused to give up on finding him. The next morning brought a breakthrough. Detectives examining Ethan's car discovered traces of blood inside, but no signs of impact severe enough to cause death. Furthermore, security footage from a nearby gas station showed Ethan stopping for fuel hours after the supposed time of the accident. According to the timestamp, he appeared unharmed, chatting casually with the attendant. This revelation threw the entire investigation into disarray. If Ethan hadn't died in the crash, then what had happened to him? News of the discovery spread, quickly igniting a frenzy of speculation among townsfolk. Some believed Ethan had staged his own disappearance, while others whispered about criminal involvement. Margaret dismissed these theories outright. Her son wasn't the type to run away without explanation, nor did he associate with dangerous people, or so she thought. Detective Harris, meanwhile, focused on tracking Ethan's movements in the days leading up to the crash. Records showed he had withdrawn a substantial amount of cash from his bank account, visited several unfamiliar locations, and made multiple calls to an unregistered number. Whoever Ethan had been communicating with clearly didn't want to be traced. Harris suspected foul play but lacked concrete evidence to prove it. While the investigation continued, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. She scoured Ethan's room, searching for clues he might have left behind. In a locked drawer beneath a stack of old sketchbooks, she found a bundle of letters tied with string. Her hands trembled as she untied the knot and unfolded the first page. The handwriting was neat but menacing. "Ethan, you don't understand what you've stumbled upon. Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She read through the rest of the letters, each one more threatening than the last. They were signed only with the name Victor. Whoever this person was, they clearly wanted Ethan silenced, and they weren't afraid to use intimidation to achieve their goal. Armed with this new information, Margaret rushed to the police station. Harris listened intently as she recounted her findings, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If Ethan uncovered something illegal, it could explain why someone targeted him. We need to track down this Victor immediately." Over the next few days, Harris and his team worked tirelessly to identify Victor. Through painstaking analysis of phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage, they pieced together a profile. Victor turned out to be a shadowy figure connected to an underground network involved in human trafficking. A chilling realization that sent shockwaves through the small town. For Margaret, the revelation was both horrifying and infuriating. Her kind-hearted, compassionate son had unwittingly crossed paths with monsters. Yet even amid the darkness, she clung to hope. If Ethan was still alive, she would move heaven and earth to save him. With Harris's guidance, she prepared herself for the fight of her life, a desperate race against time to rescue her son before it was too late. The days that followed felt like a blur for Margaret. Every waking moment was consumed by the search for Ethan, and every unanswered question gnawed at her resolve. Detective Harris had warned her that uncovering the truth about Victor and his network wouldn't be easy. These people operated in secrecy, hidden behind layers of deception and fear. But Margaret refused to back down. She knew her son was out there somewhere, and she would do whatever it took to bring him home. Harris and his team worked around the clock, piecing together fragments of evidence that painted a chilling picture. The letters signed by Victor weren't just idle threats, they were warnings from someone deeply entrenched in organized crime. Through bank records, phone logs, and surveillance footage, they discovered that Victor was part of an underground operation specializing in illegal organ trafficking. It was a sinister world where human lives were treated as commodities bought and sold for profit. And somehow Ethan had become entangled in it. Margaret couldn't fathom how her son, who spent his days helping others and creating art, could have crossed paths with such brutality. But as more details emerged, the pieces began to fall into place. Harris explained that Ethan's job at the library gave him access to public records, databases, and archives, resources that someone like Victor might exploit. Perhaps Ethan had stumbled upon information he wasn't meant to see. Maybe he'd uncovered a trail leading straight to Victor's operations. Whatever the case, his knowledge had made him a target. One evening, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table surrounded by photocopies of the threatening letters and maps of the town, Harris arrived with news. His team had traced one of Victor's aliases to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Surveillance cameras captured images of suspicious activity near the building, a black van pulling up late at night, shadowy figures moving crates inside, and occasional flickers of light from within. The location matched descriptions found in anonymous tips received by law enforcement over the years about similar operations. Harris believed this was where they might find Ethan, or at least answers about what had happened to him. "We need to move carefully," Harris cautioned, spreading out blueprints of the warehouse across the table. "These people are dangerous. If we rush in without a plan, we risk putting Ethan in even greater danger." Margaret nodded, though her heart raced with urgency. "I understand," she said firmly, "but I'm coming with you. No arguments." Harris hesitated, clearly uneasy about involving her directly in such a risky operation. But Margaret's determination was unshakable. This wasn't just another case for her, it was her son's life hanging in the balance. Finally, Harris relented, agreeing to let her join the raid under strict conditions. She would stay behind the perimeter, safe but close enough to provide support if needed. The night of the raid was tense and eerily quiet. A small team of officers, including Harris, prepared their gear and reviewed the plan one last time. Margaret waited anxiously in a parked car a short distance away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The darkness seemed suffocating, pressing down on her chest as she watched the officers disappear toward the warehouse. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Inside the warehouse, Harris and his team moved with precision, sweeping through dimly lit corridors lined with rusted machinery and discarded equipment. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and every step echoed ominously off the walls. They found signs of recent activity, medical supplies scattered carelessly on tables, IV bags dangling from makeshift stands, and surgical tools laid out as if hastily abandoned. It was clear this place had been used for illegal procedures, likely involving organ harvesting. Then faint sounds reached their ears, muffled cries coming from a locked room deeper inside the building. Harris signaled for silence as they approached cautiously. Using bolt cutters, they broke the lock and pushed open the heavy metal door. Inside, lying on a cold operating table, was Ethan. He was pale and weak, his wrists bound with ropes, but alive. Tubes snaked from his arms, connected to machines monitoring his vitals. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of voices, confusion giving way to relief when he saw Harris standing there. "Ethan," Harris whispered urgently, "we're here to get you out. Can you walk?" Ethan nodded weakly, tears streaming down his face. Officers quickly freed him from the restraints and helped him to his feet. As they guided him toward the exit, Ethan tried to speak, his voice hoarse and barely audible. They said I knew too much," he managed to choke out. "I didn't mean to, I just wanted to help." "It's okay," Harris assured him gently. "You're safe now. We'll explain everything later." Outside, Margaret spotted them emerging from the shadows and bolted from the car. When she saw Ethan, frail but alive, she ran to him, throwing her arms around him in a desperate embrace. For a moment, all the fear, anger, and exhaustion melted away, replaced by overwhelming relief. "I thought I lost you," she sobbed, holding him tightly as if afraid he might vanish again. Ethan clung to her, his body shaking with sobs. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know what else to do." "You don't have to apologize," Margaret said fiercely, brushing tears from his face. "Just promise me you'll never scare me like that again." As paramedics arrived to tend to Ethan's injuries, Harris coordinated with his team to secure the warehouse's evidence. They arrested several members of Victor's network, though Victor himself remained elusive. The investigation was far from over, but for now the immediate threat had been neutralized. Back at the hospital, Ethan recounted his harrowing ordeal. After the supposed car accident, he had been drugged and kidnapped by men working for Victor. They accused him of snooping into their activities after discovering discrepancies in local death certificates linked to missing persons cases. Fearing exposure, they decided to eliminate the threat, but not before attempting to harvest his organs for profit. Ethan had spent days in captivity, unsure if anyone would ever find him. Listening to his story, Margaret felt a mix of emotions: anger at those who had hurt her son, gratitude for the detectives who saved him, and admiration for Ethan's courage in surviving such a nightmare. Though the road ahead would be long, she vowed to stand by him every step of the way. That night, as Ethan rested in his hospital bed, Margaret sat beside him, holding his hand. Despite everything they had endured, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Her son was alive, and together they would heal. The fight wasn't over yet, not until justice was served, but for the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to believe that brighter days lay ahead. The days following Ethan's rescue were a whirlwind of activity, emotions, and revelations. Margaret stayed by her son's side at the hospital, refusing to leave even for a moment. She brought him his favorite snacks, held his hand during sleepless nights, and listened patiently as he slowly began to open up about the horrors he had endured. Though Ethan was physically safe now, the psychological scars ran deep. He often woke up in a cold sweat, reliving the moments when he thought he would never see his mother again. But Margaret was relentless in her care, determined to help him heal. Detective Harris, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to dismantle Victor's network. The arrests made during the raid on the warehouse provided valuable leads, connecting the operation to other illegal activities across the region. Officers uncovered evidence of forged documents, stolen identities, and a long list of victims whose lives had been stolen, some literally, others figuratively. It became clear that Victor's reach extended far beyond their small town, implicating corrupt officials, doctors, and businessmen who turned a blind eye in exchange for profit or protection. Margaret learned more about the trafficking ring than she ever wanted to know. What started as a desperate search for her son had opened her eyes to a dark underworld thriving in plain sight. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan lying helpless on that operating table, tubes snaking from his arms, his life hanging by a thread. The thought filled her with rage, not just toward Victor and his accomplices, but also toward the systems that allowed such evil to flourish unchecked. Ethan, too, grappled with survivor's guilt. "Why me?" he asked one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "All those people, they didn't deserve what happened to them." Margaret cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You didn't deserve it either," she said firmly. "But you're here now and you have a chance to make things right. You can use your voice to fight back for yourself and for everyone else who suffered because of these monsters." Her words struck a chord with Ethan. As he recovered, he began thinking about ways to turn his pain into purpose. With Harris's encouragement, he agreed to testify against Victor and his associates, knowing it wouldn't be easy. Testifying meant facing his captors in court, reliving every terrifying detail of his ordeal. But Ethan was resolute. If sharing his story could prevent others from suffering the same fate, he was willing to endure whatever came next. In preparation for the trial, Harris arranged for Ethan to work closely with a counselor specializing in trauma recovery. The sessions were difficult at first, dredging up memories Ethan had tried to bury. But over time, they helped him process his emotions and find strength in his vulnerability. Margaret attended some of the sessions, learning strategies to support her son through the healing process. Together, they rebuilt their bond, stronger than before. Meanwhile, Harris and his team tracked down Victor, who had gone underground after the raid. Tips poured in from informants and concerned citizens, narrowing down possible locations where he might be hiding. Finally, after weeks of searching, they cornered him in a remote cabin miles outside of town. When officers stormed the property, Victor put up little resistance, seemingly resigned to his fate. As they led him away in handcuffs, Harris felt a surge of satisfaction, but also sadness. No amount of justice could undo the damage Victor had caused. The trial dominated headlines. For months, shining a spotlight on the shadowy world of human trafficking and organ harvesting, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence linking Victor and his co-conspirators to dozens of crimes, including kidnapping, extortion, and murder. Survivors came forward, bravely recounting their own experiences in heartbreaking detail. Their testimonies painted a grim picture of exploitation and suffering, leaving jurors visibly shaken. When it was Ethan's turn to take the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Margaret sat in the front row, clutching a tissue in trembling hands as her son recounted the events leading up to his abduction and captivity. His voice wavered at times, But his resolve never faltered. He described how he'd discovered discrepancies in public records while researching a project for the library, unaware that his curiosity would place him in mortal danger. He spoke of the fear he felt when Victor's men dragged him into the van, the loneliness of being locked away in the warehouse, and the terror of realizing his organs were being targeted for sale. By the end of his testimony, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the judge paused briefly, acknowledging the courage it took for Ethan to share his story. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Margaret and Ethan, eager for quotes and reactions. But Margaret simply smiled through her tears and said, "Today isn't about us. It's about giving a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves." The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. Victor and his accomplices were sentenced to life in prison without parole, ensuring they could never harm anyone again. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, but Margaret remained composed, her focus unwavering. Justice had been served, but she knew the fight wasn't over. There were still countless victims waiting to be found, families yearning for closure, and broken systems in need of reform. Inspired by the outpouring of support from their community, Ethan decided to channel his energy into advocacy work. He partnered with local organizations dedicated to combating human trafficking, using his art and storytelling skills to raise awareness. Posters featuring his illustrations appeared in schools, libraries, and community centers, educating people about the warning signs of exploitation and encouraging them to report suspicious activity. Margaret joined him in this mission, organizing fundraisers and speaking engagements to amplify their message. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. National media outlets picked up their story, highlighting the resilience of a mother and son who refused to let tragedy define them. Lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at cracking down on illegal trafficking networks and improving protections for vulnerable populations. For Margaret and Ethan, seeing tangible change emerge from their pain was both humbling and empowering. As time passed, life began to resemble something close to normalcy, or at least, a new kind of normal. Ethan returned to his job at the library, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of shelving books and helping patrons. Margaret resumed her daily routines, though she kept a framed photo of Ethan smiling beside her bed, a reminder of how precious each day truly was. They talked openly about their experience, not as victims, but as survivors committed to making a difference. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret and Ethan stood together at the edge of the cemetery, where the funeral that changed everything had taken place. The grave intended for Ethan remained empty, a haunting symbol of what could have been. But instead of sorrow, Margaret felt gratitude. She placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the ground, whispering softly, "Thank you for giving him back to me." Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We got lucky," he said, "but we're not stopping here. We'll keep fighting. For them, for us, for everyone." And with that, they walked away, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by love, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of hope. Months had passed since the trial, and the small town that once felt so safe and predictable was beginning to heal. The story of Ethan's abduction and rescue had become a turning point, a moment when darkness was exposed, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the world around them. For Margaret and Ethan, life wasn't the same as it had been before, but in many ways it was richer. They carried scars, both visible and invisible, but they also carried a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan threw himself into his advocacy work with relentless energy. His art, once a hobby meant to bring joy, became a powerful tool for change. He created murals depicting the faces of trafficking victims, each one telling a story of resilience and hope. Schools invited him to speak to students about staying vigilant and recognizing signs of trouble. Community centers hosted workshops where he taught others how to use creativity as a form of healing. His message was simple yet profound. No matter how broken you feel, your voice matters. Margaret stood by her son every step of the way, proud of the man he had become. She marveled at his ability to transform pain into action, to channel fear into courage. Though she still woke up some nights, drenched in sweat, Haunted by memories of that fateful day at the cemetery, she reminded herself of how far they'd come. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed or even argued with her over dinner, she thanked God for giving her another chance to be his mother. The pair also worked closely with Detective Harris, who continued to investigate similar cases across the region. Together, they pushed for reforms in law enforcement training and hospital protocols to prevent future tragedies. Their efforts caught the attention of state officials, leading to new policies aimed at protecting vulnerable communities. It was slow, grueling work, but Margaret and Ethan took comfort in knowing they were part of something bigger than themselves. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled in the wind outside their cozy living room, Margaret sat knitting while Ethan sketched on a notepad. The quiet hum of the television filled the background, but neither paid much attention. Instead, they talked about everything and nothing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found you?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Ethan paused mid-stroke, considering the question. "All the time," he admitted after a moment, "but then I remind myself that we did find me, and now I get to do this." He gestured toward the sketches scattered across the coffee table, images of survivors standing tall, their eyes filled with determination. "It's like, maybe all of this happened so I could help other people who don't have anyone fighting for them." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you were special, but seeing you turn something so awful into something good, it makes me so proud." Ethan grinned, leaning over to hug her. "We make a pretty great team, huh?" "The best," Margaret agreed, squeezing him tightly. As winter approached, the town came together to honor those affected by Victor's crimes. A memorial garden was built near the library, featuring a plaque engraved with the names of victims whose lives had been stolen. Ethan designed the centerpiece, a towering sculpture of intertwined hands reaching skyward, symbolizing unity and hope. On the day of the dedication ceremony, hundreds gathered to pay their respects. Survivors shared their stories, families lit candles in memory of loved ones, and strangers held hands, united in grief and gratitude. Standing beside her son, as he addressed the crowd, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. "This isn't just a tribute to those we lost," Ethan said, his voice strong and clear. "It's a promise to keep fighting, to keep speaking out, and to never let anyone suffer in silence again." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the crisp air. Margaret wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding them. In that moment, she realized how much their journey had touched others, not just in their town, but beyond. People from neighboring cities and even different states reached out to share how Ethan's story inspired them to take action in their own communities. What started as a personal tragedy had sparked a movement, proving that even in the darkest times, light can emerge. But Margaret and Ethan didn't stop there. They understood that true justice required more than arrests and convictions. It demanded systemic change. With the help of local leaders, they established a foundation dedicated to supporting trafficking survivors and educating the public. The foundation offered counseling services, job training programs, and legal assistance to those rebuilding their lives. It also funded research initiatives aimed at identifying gaps in the system that allowed such crimes to go unnoticed for so long. For Margaret, running the foundation gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She poured her heart into organizing fundraisers, coordinating volunteers, and ensuring every dollar went toward helping those in need. Her strength and compassion earned her admiration from everyone she met. People often remarked on how gracefully she handled adversity, but Margaret simply shrugged. "When you've faced losing the person you love most," she'd say, "you realize there's nothing you can't overcome." As spring arrived, bringing with it warmer days and blooming flowers, Margaret and Ethan celebrated milestones big and small. Ethan completed his first large-scale mural downtown, attracting tourists and locals alike. Margaret received an award from the governor for her contributions to victim advocacy, and together, they marked the anniversary of Ethan's rescue with a quiet family dinner, reflecting on how far they'd come. That night, as they walked home, Under a canopy of stars, Ethan turned to his mother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling angry about what happened?" he asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Maybe not completely," she replied. "But anger doesn't have to control us. We can use it to fuel positive change to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." Ethan nodded, smiling faintly. "Yeah, that sounds like a good plan." And it was. Life would never be perfect. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Margaret and Ethan faced them head-on, side by side. They had learned that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding meaning in it, about using hardship to grow stronger and kinder. Years later, when visitors came to the memorial garden, they often lingered by the sculpture of intertwined hands. Some left notes of thanks, others placed flowers at its base. Among these tributes was a small plaque installed by Margaret and Ethan, bearing a simple inscription: "To those who fight for justice, for truth, and for love, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. Your courage will light the way." It was a reminder that though the road ahead might be long, hope and humanity would always prevail. And for Margaret and Ethan, that knowledge was enough to keep moving forward, hand in hand, toward a brighter future.